Good morning, everyone. Welcome to CSIS. Please excuse my voice. I have a little bit of a cold. I'm Dr. Kathleen Hicks. I direct the International Security Program here at CSIS. And along with our partners at USNI, we're delighted to have the privilege of running the Maritime Security Dialogue. Let me just say in advance, we thank our sponsors at HII and at Lockheed Martin for helping us put this together. Today, we will be featuring Admiral Phil Davidson, who is the commander of U.S. Fleet Forces Command, and my partner in crime from USNI, the CEO of USNI, Vice Admiral Pete Daly, will be conducting the moderation today. Let me do a quick introduction for you of Admiral Davidson, and then we'll let him take the stage. Again, excuse my voice. As I said, Admiral Davidson is the head of U.S. Fleet Forces Command. He is a surface warfare officer, and among his many assignments, he has been commander of U.S. 6th Fleet. He has been the deputy commander of U.S. Naval Forces Europe and U.S. Naval Forces Africa. He has been with the State Department with the Special Representative for Afghanistan and Pakistan, the SRAP office. He has served also in the Joint Staff as the Deputy Director for Strategy and Policy. He is a Naval Academy graduate and an all-around great guy that I've known for a long time. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Admiral Davidson.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. It's a great pleasure to be here. Thank you, Dr. Hicks. It's good to see you again. So I also want to say thank you to Admiral Daly. Both Dr. Hicks and Admiral Daly I've benefited enormously from both their leadership, mentorship, and partnership over my years. Better officer for it. So good morning. I have a couple of slides. I may or may not show them, depending on how inspired I get along the journey here. But I think that the topic title here is important to all of you. You've been hearing a lot. I've been watching the Maritime Security Dialogue go on, and you're hearing it from the bottom up, platform sponsors, tactical commanders. You're hearing it from the top down, strategic environment, third offset strategy. You've seen the CNO come over here and deliver the strategic level as well at the maritime security level. So I thought it'd be important to come talk about what I'm thinking about and what we're talking about at the operational level. So this conversation is focused very strongly at that level. So for just a minute, I want to talk about design and what we're talking about, because it's a little bit reflective of how I'm thinking about the problem. If you go to Webster's, you'll find that the definition of design has two definitions, the primary being a plan produced to show the look, the function, and the workings of an object before it is built. That's actually definition number one. The alternative words for that blueprint, a diagram model. The alternative definition is purpose, planning, or intention that exists or is thought to exist behind an action, fact, or material object itself. So I think that's important, and my job is the second for two reasons. One, I think the design, the architecture, the number of ships, what those ships are, the number of aircraft, what those aircraft are, that needs to come out of any discussion of the strategic design, which the CNO has started to lay out for you. And in my view, the operational design, what we need to be able to do with that fleet. So that pulls it up to a certain extent from the tactical level. Now I will tell you, we got to where we are by design. I believe that firmly. We get to where we are by the choices that we make, and certainly those choices have benefits, and those choices have consequences. And then what needs to exist is the courage, the process, and the ability to continually assess where you are, and then to make those changes going forward. So just in the short period looking back on the 21st century, we started this century with 314 ships and 377,000 people in that force. Okay, and today we're at 274 ships, and we have about 323,000 right today. So if you think about that over the course of about 15 years, and we could go really deep into every platform and change, I won't do that to you. If you think about that, during that 15-year time frame, we did a lot. It was more than just cuts. During that era, we shifted this force as the nation required, to do counterinsurgency, to provide for maritime security, and we adapted at the operational level. And, behind all that was taking 54,000 people out of the force, but building a cyber force for the national entities, building a cyber force for the Navy, building an NECC force in the littoral, on land with the Seabees, in the near shore, riverine, all that stuff while we took all those people out. Those all had benefits for what the nation needed at the time. Fair enough? Okay? It did not come without consequences. So some of those consequences were reducing the number of people actually in a destroyer so that we could build the number of people we wanted to build in the cyber force and the NECC, things like that. That had readiness impact, that had mission impact, because we would take out the things that we believed we didn't need. Weren't a lot of submarines operating in the Middle East in the first decade of this century. So we emptied the sonar shacks of sonar techs, put them on boarding teams, enabled them to do the counter VEO, counter piracy, counter drug, counter illicit trafficking duties that were core to that responsibility. We built the BMD force, things like that. I could go on and on. I don't want to dwell on it too much. Importantly, along the way, two things changed. First was about simultaneously. First was the cooperative strategy for the 21st century, which defined maritime security, talked about how important providing these kind of constabulary stability forces would be for a Navy. Second was a NOC, a naval operating concept, that said the way we've been operating ships, given what we know about the maritime environs and how those maritime environs are essentially unchallenged to our capability last decade, that we would be willing to disaggregate the force. And that term has profound meaning when you say disaggregate. We were willing to take apart systems, groups, task forces, to put individual platforms out there on station to conduct some of these constabulary missions with the full confidence that the risks were so low or could be handled by that individual platform that it would be able to do its mission without other support. I think that's an important thing to remember during that era. So the fleet design, as I think about it going forward, has to fit in the maritime design, absolutely, that the CNO has defined for us. Absolutely has to fit in the third offset strategy that the grand strategy is starting to define for us going forward. And then you're starting to see, as I said before, a little bit bubble up from the bottom. One of the things I want to make central to all this is I'm going to be talking about the operational level, and to me that is the fleet. And for you to think about that, you should be thinking about numbered fleet commanders, you should be thinking about Admiral Swift, Admiral Howard, those kind of people in doing this function. Okay, why don't we go to the next slide just in case. So here we are, the +1 being violent extremist organizations as well. You've heard DepSecDef and SecDef and the CNO come out and say, we have a return to great power competition with Russia and China. Okay? Now at the operational level, many of the threats that are manifest are kind of represented here, both in terms of capabilities and to a certain extent, concepts. You see some Russian activity across the top there. You see Chinese activity across the bottom there. Of course, violent extremist organizations there. Got a nice cyber diagram in the background that you can't really see there as a ballistic missile defense destroyer as well, one of ours. So the strategic landscape has fundamentally changed, and that's what caused the CNO to talk about the design for maintaining maritime superiority. He described three pressures: a heavily trafficked and contested maritime now, and I'll talk more about that. The ever-growing information environment, we're seeing that, and the massive expansion and proliferation of technology going forward. And he laid out his plan of action for 4 LOEs. And to get to one of them specifically, and our job here, he defined one of those lines of effort as enhanced power at and from the sea, and he assigned that to Fleet Forces Command to think about how we would do that. I spent a lot of time thinking about that function. And fundamentally, on the backside of it, whether it's next week or 5 years from now or 8 years from now, I view that as my job to help figure out how do you make the fleet ready to fight and win in contested and denied environments of all kinds. And that's the fundamental shift from the last decade. It was an aberration that we were unchallenged in the maritime domain, an aberration in the history of the United States Navy, that we could assume that kind of posture. So with threats from the bottom of the sea to space and cyberspace now, we have to be able to cope with that operationally. Importantly, to all that comes the power of the fleet. And I say that because as we think about the 4+1, particularly with the great power competitors, the important thing to remember is their operational approach is all very similar, and I'll talk about that, but the tactical manifestation of it all is slightly different. And that requires each individual fleet commander to think about what those capability sets are. How do I mix and match them and put them on the battlefield in the battle space to make them effective? So what do I mean? Their operational approach, Russia, China, Iran certainly, is to deny us our sea control, is to let us know that the last decade, that aberration, that we would not go unchallenged in the maritime domain. That is one of the areas in which we took risk in the last decade. We took risk in electronic warfare, we took risk in anti-submarine warfare, we took risk in over-the-horizon targeting and strike in order to do these other functions. So we have to restore those skills to the fleet. So we do that in many ways. You do that with capability, stuff that people are going to buy. We do that with capacity, the amount of stuff that they need to buy, but we need to do it with doctrine and concept and training and exercising and gaming and all that stuff as well. And that all comes down to the operational level to affect such an outcome. One of the things that's revealed to me early, and I'm going to come back to this a little bit later, but I want to plant this seed now, is the power of the fleet. And I say that because if their operational manifestation is pretty similar, there's got to be some organizing principles that string it all together. But if the tactical manifestation of those threats that these individual countries put on the battlefield is all different, there has to be enough customization to understand that the fleet challenge in each one of those, and probably what you would put in the battle space, is slightly different, if not dramatically different. And I'll come back to that a little bit. Now, all that said, choices between capability, capacity, readiness, that kind of thing, we have 4 principal advantages today that we can build on. And 2 of the things you need to know about me, importantly, when I approach these problems is, number 1, I love my job. I view these things as an optimist would view these things. If you don't get up every day with a challenge and want to take these things on, then you need to find something else to do for a living. And the second thing is, every design, every choice has benefits and consequences. And you have to be willing to define those things, determine where you're going to take those benefits and consequences and move from there. So we have 4 advantages in the fleet to build on, one of which is integrated fire controls. We have really moved the ball in the last 10 years. Good decisions by people that have gone before me to understand the power of integrated fire control networks. That capability has revealed itself over the last 15 years with ballistic missile defense in all actuality, and that serves as kind of the basis of what I'm about to tell you. We have another exceptional advantage, and it's our ability to exploit the undersea domain and dominate the undersea domain. Now, that's not to say it's all about submarines. It's also about our ability to sense, do big data processing, and exploit the undersea domain. We have an advantage there in the United States Navy. We have another advantage, and it is our inherent modularity in concept, in design, in capability as well. In concept, because we have a fleet, force, group, unit, element structure, and a task-organized approach that allows us to mix and match our capabilities for the reasons that we need it for. That is a culture that has been inherent in the United States Navy for an incredibly long time and will be sustained and something that we can rely on. We also have it in terms of capability. You need to go back and kiss Wayne Meyer's gravestone. You know, the invention of VLS in just one instance here is an extraordinary capability. The different ammo loads we can put in that module that has taken us from a Navy that could shoot about as far as the eye could see, you know, to incredible range and capability across the force. But that modularity is also inherent in other things. It's also inherent in the shape and construction of the carrier air wing, which is the fighting unit, not the squadron. The carrier air wing is the fighting unit. And if you just think back 15 years ago, you would understand how different the carrier air wing is today. Choices made, no doubt about it, from the carrier air wing of 15 years ago. But its adaptability and modularity would allow us to change it going forward. And then one of the last things, of course, you can never get away from in the Navy is volume. Volume in hulls is an important approach. Lastly is the modularity that I believe will be the mission bays and LCS will take us forward. If we're going to get unmanned in the Navy, and we don't have any intent to get unmanned for unmanned sake, it's got to be a benefit to us. The modularity that's in those mission bays is going to help us a lot. And then our last thing, of course, is our people. I could make this entire 20 minutes about the flexibility that we have. I've been participating closely over the last few years in just one example with the NIFCA wargaming that we've been conducting both within the fleet and with industry. And the lieutenants that we have operating that system and actually telling us how we're going to train, operate, and do that fight are just eye-watering in their approach to the problem, their understanding of it all, and their capability. It's true at the enlisted level. We see innovation bubble up all the time. It's really an extraordinary capability, and we're going to depend on that. I will tell you this. When I meet with some of the potential great power competitors here, they are in awe of our people and are flummoxed on how they would construct and make such a force, particularly in the near term. They have great challenges there. Okay, the output of those advantages and any fleet design is starting to rally around three concepts. And some of this is bubbled up from the bottom, one of which is distributed lethality. Okay, we are going to start talking about distribution and distributed lethality as a fleet concept, not a force concept. Please bear with me. That is a fleet concept, not just a surface force concept. Okay? We're learning a lot from distributing our firepower, our sensors, and our costs. Two of the key things to understand taking away from that is when we have a more lethal force, more widely distributed, and there's an important etymology behind that term distributed, our commanders are much more confident. And when we game it with those that would simulate potential adversaries, our adversaries are much more conservative. That's a wonderful place to be. Those of you who are old Cold Warriors like myself would understand what kind of power that puts into the battle space and will be incredibly important to us going forward. The second thing is built off this idea, what I talked about a little bit earlier, is our integrated fire control networks. There was an interesting article, I think in the Naval Institute earlier this week, discussion with PEO IWS on the F-35 Aegis tandem and what kind of multiplier that might be. If you don't understand the NIFCA system in and of itself, you know, that built on the cooperative engagement control system and is built on our baseline 9 cruisers and destroyers, built on the E-2D that is starting to flow in numbers out to the fleet now at this point, and leverages some of the missiles that these assets can carry in a way that the whole is greater than the sum of its parts, is the way to think about it. That will be an important game changer on the battlefield. And as we think about other assets coming to this structure, and I'll get back to the fleet centricity of all this in a minute, is very, very important to understand that people need to be contributing to this network. And if it can't come to this network, its value is going to be a little less to us, or we will work workarounds to get that data in. But we're putting a lot of pressure on capabilities right now to make sure that we bring all the sensors to the network. All right, then the last thing, of course, is maneuver. Got to have a United States Navy capable of maneuver. Why? Because at the strategic level, we're truly the maneuver force inside the joint force. So our ability to exploit the electromagnetic spectrum, to exploit the physical spectrum, to exploit the acoustic spectrum, and be able to maneuver at will is important to achieving our objectives and denying a potential enemy's theirs. That gets me to the fleet centricity of all this. I did not dwell too much on the third offset strategy, but I had a conversation with Deputy Secretary of Defense recently, and we were talking about, what is the organizational construct that kind of personifies the third offset strategy and makes it sound? Well, in my view, it is the fleet, as I inferred earlier. When you lay out the geography of the Eastern Mediterranean, you lay out the geography of the Strait of Hormuz, you lay out the geography of the Western Pacific. The challenges in the physical spectrum are all markedly different. What we would put in the battle space has to be effective in all those environments, not to mention the electromagnetic environment that would be put up in any of those things. So a fleet with the speed of decision, the speed of action, and the human-machine symbiosis that can make things move is going to be incredibly important. It used to be that we prepared a group, got that group all up to speed in its warfare areas, and we put it to sea, and all that function would exist inside that group. Now the power of all these platforms, be they submarines, surface forces, aircraft, MPA, the joint force, coming together and informing the whole of the fleet so that the fleet commander can operate that fleet, integrate it, distribute it, and maneuver it in a way that delivers on his objectives is incredibly important. I'm not trying to be obtuse purposely here, but I have to protect this a little bit. But there are reasons that a fleet commander will want some of his fleet to be known and some of it unknown. And his ability to command and control that is a fundamental change as we go forward. So if you look backwards 15 years, numbered fleet commander was force providing and making sure his groups were sustained and operating in a way that would enable their disaggregated function. Now, as he thinks about it going forward, he's got to synergize that group in a way that ensures that power across the fleet is distributed and whole. There is a command and control structure unique to the United States Navy, to navies, I should say, and it's called Officer and Tactical Command. The Joint Force doesn't have that classification in their C2 structures. Restoring the numbered fleet commander's ability to think, command and control, and manipulate that force all the way down to the tactical level is going to be incredibly important as we go forward. And we're making fundamental changes to do that. Everything from the warfighting development centers to what we have NWDC working on, doctrines and concepts, what we're doing in war games and experimentation, how we've got that synchronized now globally. All of that is meant to help us empower the numbered fleet commanders, not to mention the education path that we've embarked on with their staffs. So much to be done there. All right, I need to wrap up here in a couple of minutes. I want to make a couple other points here about fleet design because this will come out as people start to talk about what the Navy's architecture looks like. A fleet design must provide depth. We've got to have that. We've got to have tactical depth and depth of sensor coverage and depth of fires. We have to have it at the operational level because it needs to be useful to commanders across the whole range of military operations. Hybrid operations, all the way to the full sea control fight. And of course, and I implied this earlier, it must be and must have strategic depth, right? It's a system that can hold the fight and the adversary focus forward, away from the homeland. If you do not have a Navy that can maneuver as a component of your joint force, your fight comes home. We don't want that. That's one of the important strategic reasons we have a Navy. And the other thing is diversity in the fleet. Got to have diversity across all the domains. You need to have it across the multi-spectrum, the electromagnetic spectrum, of course. And you got to remember the power of diversity. I'm a Darwinist here when it comes to this. If you have everything that's too tilted without enough diversity and you have a disruption, you are in an extraordinarily bad place. So each platform that we put on the battlefield has its benefits and consequences. If you tilt that in one direction or another too dramatically and you have a disruption, you don't have any eggs in your basket anymore. So we need to make sure that we have that diversity as we think about it going forward. All right, I've taken enough time here, and I want to make sure that I leave time for questions here. I appreciate all your patience and tolerance. I look forward to the questions. Thanks.
Thank you. Okay, Admiral, we appreciate you sharing your thoughts with us today, because pieces of this are seeping out. But you know, as you've outlined, it's still developmental. There's a lot of engagement and thought going on, and you know, your responsibility at Fleet Forces, obviously, you are the lead on current force generation, the standards for that, and then you and Admiral Swift are really the champions of current readiness. And I wanted to ask you for your thoughts, because if you look at the goal that the CNO set out, you've got to get better, you've got to accelerate this process that you outlined to have a warfighting edge, you know, maybe just 5-8 years from now, an improvement in that. How do you get to that, and what is the thoughts about the trade-off between readiness today and the ability to meet our requirements today, and modernization and posture for tomorrow? It seems like you're accelerating what is already a difficult trade-off that the Navy has dealt with over the years. Could you give us your thoughts about the balance there?
Yeah. One, those three systems are in tension and have always been in tension and always will be in tension. To think your way through the problem, though, you can't kind of start anew every budget year. You have to think about where you've been and where you're going on these things. One of my personal frustrations just in the last couple of years was making sure that we were having a sound and whole conversation across the span of the capability, capacity, and readiness structure to make sure that these things are accounted for. So as I think about readiness, the current readiness is important. For a force that is required to operate in international waters, in those domains and environs, we have to be there to a certain extent, 365 days a year, or the environment becomes unknown to you. So there is always going to be a force that is postured, to use your word, forward. And our readiness has to provide for that rotational force. We take very little risk in that today. The guys that we send forward, they get everything they need. Okay, so you also have to be postured to surge many if you had to for a fight, a big fight kind of thing. We take a little risk there in this day and age. And then, of course, there's the tension with buying new, modernization, as you said, and the new capability going forward. The important factors in it at the execution level, which happens at Admiral Swift's level and my level, is to make sure that we have transparency. And all of us that are executing across the whole of Echelon 2, NAV-C, NAV-Air, all the SysComs, NAV-SUP, the fleets, scenic, all that, is that we have transparency on our accounts and with our intent to make sure that all those dollars are sound. And then in the budget formulation side, the interaction between Echelon 1 and Echelon 2 is that conversation has to be as transparent as well, so that we know the risks. Again, I've said this a couple of times here, the consequences and benefits of our decisions, so we have those sound going into execution on any year. I think that conversation has gotten much better in my time at Fleet Forces Command. There will always be choices. We will not always be able to get away from the choices. But there are some sound facts that we kind of know. 10 years from now, 70% of what I have is going to go into any fight. So making sure that those formations are whole and sound 10 years from now is a readiness factor that we have to consider. And I think that's important. That said, the point of the maritime design, the speed at which things come in, is important. I've got to be able to find the time and space to modernize that fleet and to bring in new capabilities in a way that the people can handle and the fleet commanders can employ. That's sound. At the end of the day, you have to have an honest conversation about it. You have to understand the benefits and the consequences, and you have to be willing to accept the decisions that you make with the risks that are inherent to that, and make it right going forward.
Thank you. If you look at the integrated warfighting design effort that you outlined, and obviously that's one of the big features of all this. There's these components that just pop out for me. First is conceptual. You mentioned the NOC, the Naval Operation Concept, but there's all these other knock-on effects of that, like Naval Doctrine Pub 1 and all the NWP work. And I know that the Naval Warfare Doctrine Command is a direct report to you. Then on the other side of the equation, you've got the requirements and acquisition side, and there would have to be a very thorough analysis of the material solutions and the risks and the consequences that you talked about of these choices. So how do you see that playing out? It seems like you've got this operational piece. Obviously, you've got the doctrinal piece. And then there's this other piece that happens here. And finally, are the Marines in this mix?
Yes. So you're hearing the Marines already talk about distributed operations, and they have documentation on the street as well. Our documentation is kind of spawned from the bottom up. That's not the right way to say it. Our documentation started with the electromagnetic maneuver warfare concept and will be captured in the fleet design as we go forward. That design will initially manifest itself as a white paper, but I do see it like you articulated. There would be an NDP-1 that would result from the direction that we're going forward that would articulate this fleet design. We have a number of efforts going on in concepts and doctrine right now. Most of these efforts are classified. I don't want to speak to them here extensively. But the machine is kind of cranked up.
But without getting classified, is the composite warfare commander concept, do you see that getting blown up or embraced?
Yeah, I don't think it, I think the CWC concept as a whole will be embraced. It will certainly be looked at. The Marines have asked us whether they have a tactical role in the CWC concept. We are experimenting with it right now, and we did in the Bold Alligator tabletop that occurred last fall. We will in August, which is a synthetic exercise in August, experiment with that, and we'll have to make that sound going forward. I do believe personally, and I implied this earlier, when we talked about task-organized culture of the United States Navy, and our ability to, centrally plan and decentralize, conduct decentralized execution. Those principles will be pretty sound going forward.
Right.
There will be some delivery of capability that will be required to make that sounder as we go forward, but it's a culture and experience that I think is going to be important to us.
And I jumped in with the CWC part before you had a chance to really talk about the Pentagon part, the requirements, and follow-on acquisition piece. Is there, I know you guys aren't done yet. That guy got that.
Right.
But there also seems to be some concurrency here. Is there a good exchange between the fleet operational conceptual work and the systems aspects?
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the things we've done is we've mapped out what's happening at the fleet operational level in gaming. And we're mapping out, what's happening at what I call program games, future concepts, to see, how these things might come together going forward. And I I personally believe, particularly the development of this budget, but in the three I've been involved with closely, the transparency between those two things is a much closer collaboration. In my headquarters alone, and I've talked about this a couple of times, so I won't dwell on it here, we've worked hard to set up processes where our warfighters are talking to our requirements guys in a much more collaborative manner.
Right.
I call it fleet development and fleet generation, to make sure those two things are a tighter circle so that the training is delivered earlier.
Right, in that regard, it seems like you're acting as fleet forces more along the concept that fleet forces was originally set up to do.
Fair enough.
Yeah. Okay, well, I think we can open it up to some questions here, and I'll open up this gentleman right here in the second row, right there.
Morning, Admiral. Dr. Pete Haynes. If it looks like I'm uncomfortable in the suits because I just retired about 20 days ago or so. I joined CSBA the next day, and then the day after that, Brian Clark grabbed me for his study on supporting issues. And if I can make a plug for Naval Institute, I am a Naval Institute author of a fairly controversial book that fortunately the CNO has recommended and is evidently finding its way around fleet forces. We were discussing the other day our group we were doing essentially an assessment of the Navy's operational concepts and the process by which they are developed. And this kind of goes, following to Admiral Daly's questions. One, what kind of operational concepts do you think that we're kind of missing right now? Two, are you satisfied with the process? And three, are you also thinking about not operational concepts, but institutional concepts? Institutional concepts like, Clark had put together with Sea Power 21, for example.
I didn't get, can you say that last part again? Institutional concepts? Like
yes, sir. If we argue that the Navy has to be as adaptable institutionally as it is operationally, this is in terms of getting the speed at which we get new technology, new software into ships. Have you guys thought much on institutional strategies? Who develops that? What is the process? And what kind of institutional strategies or institutional concepts readily come to mind?
Well, let's talk about one of them to see if we're on the same wavelength here, and then come back at me if your question is actually different. One of which is our individual sailor training concept. So how we deliver that training to the sailors. And how those sailors bear that training in terms of rating and capability and set and when it's delivered. We're unraveling all that right now to see if there's a better sequence in that. For example, really high-tech electronic technicians, will deliver a whole bunch of capability over the course of about 2 years right at their initial come into the Navy piece. And then we're finding that we lose a lot of that if they leave the Navy after 6 years, and we're not getting much return on that. So is there a way to kind of redeliver that training so it's better synchronized with the unit that they're going to, better synchronized with their professional development, and we get better return on it going forward? So that's just one example. We have another one, I would say, that's an institutional change, is the Warfighting Development Centers. Outside of NAUTIC, NSOC in the old parlance, we didn't have capability developing going on in a coherent manner in the other platforms, and arguably with the undersea domain. We've restored that now. And the turn between the fleet and those tactical developers is pretty tight. I'm very pleased with that. The Surface Force and their designation of WITIs, weapons training instructors, we're seeing benefits on it extraordinarily quickly. And culturally, the Surface Force is accepting those things pretty well. I'm actually very pleased. It's gone better than I would have anticipated going forward. So, those are a couple of examples of institutional change we're trying to do that speak to actually what he's placed into the design to make us sound going whole. Fair enough? Okay.
Megan?
Hi, sir. Megan Eckstein with U.S. Naval Institute News. You talked about the modularity of the fleet. Out on the West Coast, they've put together the 3-destroyer SAG to go after some of the threats that they may face. I was wondering on the East Coast fleet if you guys have looked at either doing a similar SAG or some other type of ship construct to specifically address the threats that you anticipate.
Well, one of the things that we benefit from is we put a number of these things out there all the time. So, fundamentally what you've had operating in the Eastern Mediterranean and sourced from the East Coast was ballistic missile defense SAGs for quite a stretch. Last year, we actually ran an extra destroyer out there to complement their defenses because we had the availability and we had the right capability set in that destroyer ready at the right time. This is another way of saying I'm happy to put any tactical level formation out there that meets a fleet commander's need, particularly in the rotational force at the phase 0 level. More interesting to me in the very current is making sure that that force benefits from this distributed architecture I'm starting to describe going forward. Fair enough? Okay.
Sidney Freeberg?
Thanks. Sidney Freeberg, Breaking Defense. To follow up, I'm actually quite loud enough, really, but to follow up in many ways on Megan's question, you talked in this distributed architecture you mentioned, you've talked about the numbered fleet commanders taking on a much more operational role as opposed to a supporter, enabler, resourcer role. Talk to me about that evolving operational concept, which seems to be, to some degree disaggregating and distributing what were traditionally the coin of the realm, the carrier strike groups and amphibious ready groups, connecting them to this network and sort of having a picture of the whole on a much wider scale, presumably matched up against a sort of similar theater-sized anti-access or denial system as the opponent. How do you operate on that higher level?
What do you mean how you operate? How the numbered fleet commander? How's the numbered fleet commander operate on that higher level?
How's it different from traditional, more strike-centered operation?
Well, a couple of things that make it more profound for them is the idea of integrated fire control networks. Correct? Okay, and then more lethal fires that are more widely distributed, particularly in a sea control fight. If you've got a much wider basis to control the sea, the lethality distributed across multiple other surface platforms, that is what empowers that fleet commander to better define and control the objectives that he's trying to achieve while denying the enemy his.
But Admiral, also isn't embedded in there a more Navy-centric view holistically about how we fight? We've kind of digressed when a permissive environment that you talked about in your remarks into a enabler provider mode.
Yeah.
And now this shift back to having near peer adversaries, peer-like in a regional sense. Doesn't that demand that the Navy have a much better sense? That's what I took from your remarks about officer and tactical command, the operational numbered fleet view of how you fight. Is that, I think that's related to what Sidney might be asking about, which is this, instead of just depending on the O plan or depending on the next thing that was asked for, having a more holistic view of how you put it all together in this higher end environment.
Yeah, precisely. I keep coming back to delivering on objectives and denying the enemy his. Many of those objectives and the denial of objectives are joint objectives, right? These are the grand theater objectives that you're trying to achieve there. The naval component commander, the numbered fleet commander, his ability to do that function, let's face it, over the last 15 years, he was a supporting commander. It is not out of the realm of possibility and much more likely going forward that he would be a supported commander in any joint construct.
Kevin Winsing.
Admiral, quick question about our international partners, and our international partners as you plan the future force and fleet. How do they play in this, and also the Coast Guard? How do they play in it? Maybe even in the maritime, U.S. Merchant Marine, and so forth. Do they have any role in in all this planning?
Absolutely. So from the Allied piece, I'm the beneficiary of commanding a NATO formation and being steeped deeply in NATO command and control and procedures. There's a basis here on the East Coast in which to operate that's pretty sound. And there is capability growth coming across many of the allies there, and I think that's really strong. I know that Admiral Lecoyne and Admiral Swift out in the Pacific are working with allies quite deeply as well, and there is a role for them in addition to partners out there in the theater. Having this conversation with them totally transparently. Certainly with the Center of Excellence, the Joint Operating from the Sea Center of Excellence is down there in Norfolk. I have this conversation with SAC-T down there as well. So I think that's goodness. The second question, Kevin?
Coast Guard, U.S. Marine, and other elements of the U.S.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the things in a more widely distributed force, one of the outcomes of that is more widely distributed logistics. That has an effect there. So our partnership, certainly an understanding of how that logistics force will operate, both in the operational sense, what Military Sea Lift Command brings me, and in a strategic sense, what the connections are to Military Sea Lift Command. There will be changes going forward.
Question over here. Please identify yourselves as you ask a question.
Hey, sir, Justin Doubleday with InsideDefense.com. One of the things that came out of the CNO's design for maintaining maritime superiority was to look at the relationship between your command, U.S. Fleet Forces Command, and Pacific Command. Has that work started or even been completed yet? And what are some of those changes to get after force generation?
There are no changes at this point. It's all just, what would you call it, COA development. And there's a lot of factors that have come kind of late to this game. There are proposals in the FY17 NDAA that would affect some of these outcomes. So we're trying to capture these things as they come in, and we're just in the COA development phase at this point. So there haven't been any changes instituted at this point. I'll tell you, there's a couple of cultural things that we've gotten done pretty good is across Echelon 2, the institution of transparency on accounts to make sure that one command's savings doesn't turn into another command's bill, or if they are going to do that, we have transparency about that either in advance or in execution is important. That's a cultural change that factually CNO Greenert brought to the party, and CNO Richardson has helped improve that transparency.
Okay. Question here in the check shirt there, that gentleman.
Thanks. My name is Nick Peterson. I'm just a student at Connecticut College in New London, Connecticut, right by the Coast Guard Academy, actually. And I was wondering, what sort of situation kind of drives you to be, like in your mind, drives you to be so proactive in all these strategies and naval integration, everything? Like, what is kind of your worst case situation and how you, like, over long term, like trying to counteract it?
Let me wait, leave him the microphone, please leave him the mic, just so I make sure I get this right. So your question is?
So, like, in your mind, kind of, I don't want to say, like, what are you afraid of, but what is driving you to be so proactive as far as, like...
Motivation.
Motivation, yeah, exactly.
What's motivating all these
What's
changes?
motivating all this?
Well, I think one is the strategic environment that I articulated. Pulling it down to my operational level, there are threats that are manifest that we didn't experience in the last decade. That's one thing that causes you to think about that. At the strategic level, some of the threats that are manifest, you have to scratch your head and say, why is this country building a force of this size and capability? What extant threats do they have to them that would cause them to pursue this nature of their security? That makes me wonder about what their intended use is of it. We have to be prepared for those things. One of the things that came out in the CS21 refresh, the Navy's cooperative strategy for the 21st century refresh that came out about a year ago, was the idea that we all benefit from maritime security. So I view it as core to my role to assess that environment continuously and then be able to articulate what I think the capabilities and concepts are that would help us ensure that maritime security.
Can I ask a follow-up?
Sure.
What's your worst-case situation?
My worst case situation?
What keeps you up at night?
Yeah.
What keeps me up at night? I have to tell you something. I don't lay awake at night worrying about the battle space. There are threats that manifest themselves at the tactical level that make you grind your teeth. And then I get a bunch of smart young people, together, and they think their way through the technology and the concepts that would defeat it, and they do pretty well. And these things aren't concepts. They actually happen, around the globe on a week-to-week basis. I can only measure the force in terms of its combat success. I've got a carrier strike group forward right now, the Harry S. Truman, that's about to come home. Somebody wrote about this the other day. They've delivered more than 2,000 strikes here in the last 6 months. They are doing an extraordinary job.
Thank you.
You bet.
Okay. Question here with this gentleman right here in the gray suit.
Admiral, thank you for your comments. George Root, a local advanced technology consultant. You mentioned the third offset. Mm-hmm. Certainly Secretary Work is focused portion of that on unmanned systems. Mm-hmm. Made a lot of good advances in the airborne unmanned systems over the last few years. Mm-hmm. Can you tell us what's going to happen on the surface side, particularly with ACTUV and smaller unmanned surface vessels?
Mm-hmm. You mean program-wise? Yes, I'm not the right guy to talk to you about program-wise. Yeah, on the experimentation side, let me put it this way. Two of the key components in the third offset strategy are human-machine symbiosis and autonomy. When you turn around amongst the Joint Force and you say, anybody have any experience with this? Oh my God, the United States Navy does. So again, we can all go over and kiss Wayne E. Meyer's gravestone over this, but the human-machine symbiosis between the Aegis weapon system, that radar, the C&D, and the weapons control is incredible experience to have under our belts over the last 30 years. The autonomy that is potential in it already exists, but has some potential in it as well. It also gives us a basis on which to build on going forward. So when we start talking about unmanned vehicles and how we integrate those into our networks and our ability to adapt to those in the United States Navy, I think we come to this pretty quickly. On the surface side, I think there is incredible opportunity. One of the sheer bases of the surface problem is being able to see farther than the horizon, whether that's electronically or by sight. Your ability to extend that horizon helps with airborne platforms, and it is greatly assisted by surface-borne platforms as well. Additionally, they would allow you to extend your sight underneath the water. So we see enormous potential there. Some of those assets will be big, like the ACTUV, can go a long way. Some of those other assets will be small and will have to be employed from a modular kind of ship that has the capacity and the space and then the node to command and control them as well. We see great potential there.
Okay, this young lady over here has had her hand up.
Hi, I'm Skylar Moore from Renaissance Strategic Advisors. So when you're talking about undersea and modularity, that kind of seems to push very much towards an unmanned undersea fleet. And while I understand that the modularity kind of builds in its own cost efficiencies, I was curious what the trade-offs would be in your mind in terms of capability downgrades or even platform downgrades or...
Did you say downgrades?
Not down.
Oh.
I won't use the word downgrades, but what are the trade-offs of building up an undersea capability? Because at the end of the day, that's not cheap, ranging from knife fish to XLUUV.
Just because it's a little boomy in here, I just want to make sure. What are the trade-offs with building an unmanned undersea fleet? Is that what you're asking?
Yes. I mean, I'm thinking of it more in terms of the general undersea capabilities, but specifically AUVs seem like a cost that you can actually place more because there are actual platforms. So as you're building up that cost, I understand that you get some cost efficiencies from modularity, but what has to be balanced and traded off from that cost?
All those things have to be traded off. One of the things that has to be considered, in any program is kind of the cost and what the trade-offs might be. I think it's a leap too far right at this point to say there is manned or there is unmanned, and I think that's a false choice. There has to be a complement to these things. One of the things that needs to be more thoroughly studied is how is unmanned handled on the battlefield? And by that, I don't mean how do we command and control it. I mean, how does an enemy treat it? And if you are overinvested in unmanned, what happens if the enemy just sweeps it off the battle space when you're in phase 0? What does that mean to warfare? What does it mean to escalation? What does it mean to de-escalation? I think those things need to be more profoundly studied as we discuss what the trade space is between manned and unmanned.
And it might not just be just to jump in, it might not just be a trade-off. You mentioned Navy integrated fire control counter-air. Do you envision Navy integrated fire control undersea?
The potential could be there.
Got it. Using what you have better.
Yeah.
Got it. I think we have time for just one more. This gentleman over here.
Peter Pennington, Royal Navy, retired. Trafalgar, Jutland, Leyte Gulf. In each case, the final killer punch was not delivered because local tactical commanders had their own interpretation of orders. Discuss.
Always the case throughout history and will be the case going forward. The fog, the friction on the battlefield will never be free of that in its entirety. Having commanders that are adequately trained is important to the readiness calculus and the understanding as to whether your capability and capacity of it all is sound. That comes from training and education, and we'll have to keep doing that going forward. And it speaks back to Admiral Daly's very first question to me. How do you handle your current readiness while you think about your future readiness? The old Greek proverb about anybody can man the helm when the seas are calm is an important one. If the fight is 30 years from now, I sure hope we've got a commander in place that has been tested and trained to handle it, not only when the seas are not calm, but when somebody is shooting at you.
Well, Admiral, you've given us a lot to think about, and it's also remarkable, really, when you think of the tentacles and threads to this whole conversation. They are vast and many. But we thank you for coming up here today, both on behalf of CSIS and the Naval Institute. We thank you. And we also thank our sponsors, Lockheed Martin and Huntington Ingalls, for making this Maritime Security Dialogue series possible. And so thank you, sir.
Thank you. That's good. Great. Thank you. Thanks.